Hello guys and welcome back. If you are new around here, I cover mostly Australian cases and today we are covering another solved case, perhaps one of Australia's most disturbing cases, at least the most disturbing to me. Having said that, I'm going to be putting a warning in here at the beginning. I'll also have timestamps throughout the video if you want to skip parts. I'll be keeping the most graphic details to a minimum, of course, but it is a horrific case nonetheless. And if you are not new around here, you'll know I actually had a channel before this one where I did crime cases and lifestyle content before making the switch over to this channel to fully commit to talking about cases. All the cases on that channel have now been privated because honestly I don't feel like they were my best work. I was just starting out, and although the information, to the best of my knowledge at least, is accurate, my storytelling was subpar to say the very least. However, quite a few of those cases I covered over there that you guys have possibly never seen before get requested a lot on this channel, particularly today's case. Plus, many of my early cases are some of the cases that really sparked my interest in true crime. Today being one of those cases. In fact, I'd say today's case has had one of the biggest impacts on me, along with the Claremont case, which by the way, we should be hearing a verdict on in September, but that is neither here nor there today. So my point is, I'm redoing a few of those earlier videos. I still want the cases to be out there and be accessible on this channel, but I want the quality to be of a higher standard. I don't just want to re-upload an old video. I also want to mention my source for much of this video comes from this book right here, which if you love true crime as much as I do, I cannot recommend this highly enough to you. Just ignore all my little post-it notes. I'm going to be reading a few bits from this book as we go along. Having said all of that, let's get straight into today's solved case. So we're heading right back to the year of 1986, a year which I suspect many of us, myself included, were not yet born. In Sydney, New South Wales, lived nurse and former beauty pageant queen Anita Cobby, born Anita Lorraine Lynch. She was born on November the 2nd, 1959 to parents Gary and Grace Lynch, and she also had a younger sister named Catherine. In her later teen years and early 20s, Anita competed in beauty pageants, even winning Miss Western Suburbs of 1979. Anita really showed promise as a future model, and it's pretty easy to see why. Not only was she a naturally beautiful woman, but according to friends and family, she had an even more stunning personality to go along with her physical beauty. She was described as caring, loving, generous, which is exactly what led her into what would become her career and passion, nursing. A career that her mother, Grace, also happened to be in. And by all accounts, it was a case of like mother, like daughter. The name Grace was a very fitting name for Grace Lynch, who was a kind and eloquent woman that no doubt raised Anita, along with her husband of course, with love and compassion. But I'll talk a little bit more about Grace and Gary Lynch later in the video. So at 20 years old, Anita started her nursing degree at Sydney Hospital, and this is where she met her future husband, John Cobby, who was 23 years old and also a nurse. John fell head over heels for Anita. He could hardly even believe his luck that such a beautiful woman would be interested in him. He felt incredibly lucky to be with a woman like Anita. But John himself was quite the catch. As I said, he was a nurse, so he was caring by nature, and by the sounds of it, he was an incredibly charming and charismatic person. After 1 year of dating, the pair were engaged, and by March of 1982, Anita and John were married. Just after they got engaged, Anita actually fell pregnant, but unfortunately she suffered a miscarriage. The pair had planned to try again, but unfortunately that opportunity would never come. 4 years after getting married, the pair were having some marital issues, and by 1986, Anita, who was now 26 years old, was back living with her parents in Blacktown, Sydney. It is a little unclear, however, as to whether this separation was meant to be temporary or whether their marriage was heading for divorce. According to John, the separation was meant to be temporary, but if you were to ask Anita's friends, she had been dating other men since the separation and had no plans of getting back with her husband. So now we're going to talk about February the 2nd, 1986. On this day, a Sunday, Anita had been working the day shift, which was 7:30 a.m. till 3 p.m. at Sydney Hospital, located on Macquarie Street, and I did a little old Google research, as I'm not a Sydney local, sadly, because I love Sydney. But anyway, it appears that Sydney Hospital is still there, located in the same location. And for reference, Macquarie Street is a street that runs through the Sydney CBD, so Anita worked in a very busy and central location in Sydney. And on this particular day, Anita had made plans to catch up with a few friends for dinner after work. By all accounts, it was a pretty ordinary day. She caught the train from her parents' house in Blacktown to work, finished her shift and got changed into appropriate dinner attire, which on this day happened to be a white sleeveless shirt, a black belt around her waist and fitted pants. She then met her friends for dinner, which wrapped up at around 8:30 p.m. that evening. Anita's friend, Lynn Bradshaw, offered to drive Anita back to the Central Railway Station, Sydney's main train station, after dinner, which Anita accepted. So she caught the train from there, which took her directly to her parents' house in Blacktown. And this was approximately a 45-minute train journey. Anita boarded her train at around 9:12 p.m. that evening and arrived in Blacktown at around 10 p.m. Upon arriving in Blacktown, Anita went to a payphone to call her father for a lift home, which was her usual routine. Of course, remembering this was long before mobile phones or cell phones for my American friends. So the old Telstra phone box we have here in Oz was the only option. But on this particular night, all of the payphones at the Blacktown train station were out of order due to vandalisation, I believe. And to top it off, there were no taxis waiting at the taxi rank. Anita's parents' house wasn't actually too far from the train station though, and it was a warm summer night, so instead of waiting around for a taxi, which on a Sunday evening could have been a long wait, or walking to another payphone, Anita decided it would simply just be easier if she walked the 2 kilometres or 1.2-ish miles home. However, Anita would never make it back to her parents' house that night. Now look, as I said, I'm not a Sydney local, however I do have family there and have spent considerable time over in Sydney, and to the best of my knowledge, Blacktown is not a safe neighbourhood. It wasn't then, and I don't think it is now. But if you are from that area, feel free to correct me in the comments below. Has Blacktown become a safer area? I'd really be interested to know, and I'm sorry if I just offended anybody, but I digress. So one person did see what happened to Anita on that evening. A 13-year-old boy. Just after 10 p.m. on Newton Road in Blacktown, not far from the Blacktown train station, a 13-year-old boy and his family heard a terrified scream. The young boy ran outside just in time to see Anita being dragged into a car by 2 men. The boy ran across the road intending to help, but he wasn't fast enough and Anita was gone. He did see the car model though, a HT Holden Kingswood. The young boy and his neighbours did later drive around and search for the car, but were unsuccessful in locating it, or at least that's what they thought. The boy of course reported the incident to the police. So the next morning, which was February the 3rd, a Monday, Anita's parents noticed she had not returned home for the night. However, she was a 26-year-old woman and it wasn't uncommon for her to stay at friends' houses overnight. They thought maybe she'd just stayed with a friend in the city to avoid the 45-minute train journey home, so they weren't particularly worried. However, when Anita did not turn up for work that same day, her family became very concerned, as it was extremely out of her character to just not show up for work, and she was immediately reported missing to the police. Her estranged husband, John Cobby, was also informed. The next morning on February the 4th, which was a Tuesday, in the suburb of Prospect, a farmer was looking out onto his cow paddock when he noticed a bunch of cows milling about in the same area, which he considered pretty unusual. So he took a wander over to investigate. This is where he discovered the lifeless, naked, and brutally beaten body of a woman. The farmer, of course, immediately called the police. Investigators eventually identified the body as a missing woman, Anita Cobby, who was able to be identified due to a distinctive looking wedding ring which she was still wearing on her finger. Perhaps a sign that she had indeed intended to reunite with her husband in the future. Gary Lynch, Anita's father, who would become somewhat of the spokesperson for his family after Anita's death, was the one that had to identify his daughter's body. John Cobby said he just didn't feel capable of doing it, and police officers would not allow Grace to be the one to do it, believing it would be too much for a woman and mother to bear. When Gary saw his daughter lying in the morgue, his knees buckled. It was Anita. He stated, "I could wish it was someone else's daughter, but I can't, can I? They would then have to go through what we're going through." Gary also asked police officers if Anita had been traumatized in the attack, but officers couldn't bring themselves to give him an answer. However, it would not be long until the family found out exactly what happened to Anita in a very unconventional way. And as with pretty much all cases involving homicide, the first place investigators look is the family, particularly if there is one, the husband. In this case, an estranged husband, which never looks too good when it comes to a homicide investigation. John Cobby was, of course, brought in for questioning over his wife's death, and by this stage not only was John overcome with grief, but he felt an immense sense of guilt over not being there to protect his wife. The guilt, along with pressure during questioning, is what made John Cobby confess to killing his wife, telling police, "I must have done it." Although by the sounds of my research he was somewhat coerced into giving this confession. I think it was that, along with the guilt, that made him do it. But anyway, to clear it up right now, John did not kill his wife Anita and was cleared of her death pretty early in the investigation. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about John soon, because his life post Anita's passing was, as you can imagine, not an easy one. He ended up temporarily leaving Australia, becoming a bit of a recluse, and even changing his name to John Francis for many years to escape any association with Anita. 2 days after the discovery of Anita Cobby's body, the New South Wales state government posted a $50,000 reward for anyone that had any information that would lead to the arrest of Anita's killer or killers. A few days after this, that money would be increased to $100,000. Anita's case was really one of those cases that immediately caught the Australian public's attention, because who would want to hurt a young woman, a nurse, a wife, sister, daughter, just heading home after catching up with friends? And who would have abducted her? People were sad, angry, and demanded her killer or killers be caught ASAP and be punished to the full extent of the law. However, the Australian public's anger escalated on February the 6th when radio host John Laws, a well-known and respected radio personality at the time, revealed live on-air extensive details about Anita Cobby's death. Details the public had not yet heard. So John Laws actually had a copy of Anita's autopsy report, and he believed that the public deserved to know the full extent of how this woman had suffered. Now, I'm going to say it here, let's remember, this was 1986. I realise something like this would never ever happen today. Would now consider a move like this a violation, disrespectful, or at the very least, a major interference with an investigation. But regardless, John Laws was given a copy, or actually he was faxed a copy, of the confidential autopsy report, although to this day he will not say who gave it to him. But whoever it was, likely a police officer or a coroner, must have agreed that the public needed to hear what happened to Anita. Now I'm going to read part of what John Laws read live on air. I'll insert a timestamp if you want to skip it, but it's basically a description of the injuries Anita obtained, written as you would imagine an autopsy report to be written. Not necessarily gory, but of course very disturbing nonetheless. So starting now, I'm going to be reading from this book. The deceased suffered a number of wounds to the neck which severed the carotid artery, trachea and esophagus and spinal cord, and apparently died from severe loss of blood from all 3 wounds. The neck injuries were so severe that the head was almost severed from the body. There was bruising and swelling to both eyes, consistent with having been punched, together with a number of bruises to the skull. An x-ray of the body will be taken on the 5th of the 2nd, 1986 to establish whether both shoulders have been either dislocated or fractured. There were several other lacerations apparently caused by a knife to her face and multiple lacerations to both hands and fingers. 2 fingers on the left hand were fractured and some joints almost severed. The body showed other signs of having been beaten, probably during a very violent struggle which Dr. Malouf considers has taken place prior to death. And that is just part of what he read, and that is just some of the injuries that Anita obtained. So as you can imagine, it was a very violent end, and if you are interested in further details, again, this book sounds like I'm sponsored by this book, but I'm obviously not. I will leave it down below for you though if you want to purchase it. It's full on, but it's very interesting. And again, it was actually written in collaboration with her husband John, so it is a very accurate depiction of what has happened over the years. Of course, as soon as this was read live on air that morning, not only did the public go into somewhat of a frenzy, phoning the radio station with their thoughts of disgust, horror and disbelief, but senior police officers went into crisis mode. They wanted to know who the heck had leaked the autopsy report, but they never found out. And to the best of my knowledge, to this day, they still don't know. Anita's family were also understandably upset that the details of her death had been read live on radio, because this was actually the first time they themselves were hearing the horrific details. However, Anita's father would later go on to say to John Laws it was something that needed to be done. All of the officers on Anita Cobby's investigation were swiftly removed after this leak, and a new team was formed. In 2015, John Laws stated regarding reading the autopsy live on air, "I spent hours deciding whether I would or not, but in the end I decided the public had the right to know what these bastards had done to her." There were parts I didn't read though. On February the 9th, a Sunday, investigators still had no answers as to who had killed Anita Cobby. So they decided to create a reenactment of her final hours in hopes of jogging the memory of anyone that may have seen her on her final evening alive. Constable Debbie Wallace, who was a similar height and build to Anita, was chosen to portray her in the reenactment. Dressed similar to the way Anita had been in a white sleeveless top, fitted pants and a waist belt, Constable Wallace caught the same train that Anita had, the 9:12 p.m. train, from Sydney's Central Railway Station to Blacktown, and during the 45-minute train journey, Constable Wallace walked up and down the train in an effort to jog people's memories as police interviewed passengers on the train. Not long after this, police finally received a tip that appeared may be helpful. It appeared that the HT Holden Kingswood that Anita was last seen being forced into, witnessed by the 13-year-old boy, had potentially been located and was a stolen vehicle. And 5 men in particular were under suspicion for stealing this vehicle. Career criminals John Travers and Michael Murphy, along with 3 brothers with a long criminal history, Les, Michael and Gary Murphy. On the 21st of February, John Travers, Michael Murdoch and Les Murphy were arrested in relation to the stolen car and questioned about Anita's death. Murdoch and Murphy ended up being charged with offences relating to the stolen vehicle, but were both released on bail. Meanwhile, John Travers, who also admitted to stealing the car, made some conflicting statements when questioned about Anita and ended up being detained in custody. While John Travers was sitting in custody, he requested that police phone a friend of his to bring him some cigarettes in jail. Again, this was 1986. I don't know if this was normal to request this kind of thing, but regardless, Travers handed police a telephone number of someone they could call. This person was in fact John Travers' auntie, but would go on to become known as Miss X. Police did as Travers requested and phoned his auntie, but when they did, they requested a little more than a pack of cigarettes from her. They asked for her to participate in their investigation that suspected that John Travers, as well as the 4 men I mentioned before, having some sort of involvement in the death of Anita Cobby. Miss X agreed to assist police by wearing a listening device when she went to visit her nephew in his cell and hand him the cigarettes. She also provided police with additional information about John Travers' disturbing past, which I'll get into in a little bit. I can only assume that Travers and his auntie had a pretty close relationship because it didn't take long before he started opening up to her. She started by asking Travers if he had had sex with Anita. I'm sure she meant to ask, did you rape Anita? But since she was attempting to get information out of him, she probably wanted to make the conversation seem a little more casual. So he replied yes, and quickly mentioned the other 4 men involved in the abduction and assault: Michael Murdoch and the 3 Murphy brothers, Les, Michael and Gary. He told his auntie that the 5 of them had been drunk when they did what they did, and were worried that Anita would be able to identify them, so they made the decision to kill her. In response, his auntie, who I can only assume would have been shocked by this confession, said, "But that's not your thing, John. Have you done this before?" In the recording, Travers can be heard laughing as he explains to his auntie what happened before his auntie snaps at him, "Don't laugh, it's not funny."
But it's not your thing, John. You haven't done it before, have you? Truthfully, don't laugh. It's not funny.
Miss X also paid a visit to Michael Murphy, who was out on bail, in an effort to corroborate what Travers had told her, and corroborate it he did. I need a different word for that. The confessions of both John Travers and Michael Murphy were enough to have all 5 men, Travers, Murdoch and the Murphy brothers, arrested and charged with the abduction, sexual assault and death of Anita Cobby. It's also worth adding in here and reminding everybody that when Gary Murphy was arrested, he actually peed his pants. I'll pop a photo on screen for you now because even 30-something years later, he's known here in Australia at least as the killer, the fully grown man that peed himself in fear upon his arrest. I know that really has no relevance to this case, but I just don't want people to forget what cowards these men were. What scared little... I can't even think of a word that I can say here on YouTube, but you get the point. It was at this point 22 days since Anita had been killed, and as for Miss X and why she was given the name Miss X, unfortunately due to her participation in putting away her nephew and his friends, she received a number of death threats from his associates, I suppose, and to this day she remains in witness protection. So let's head back to the night that Anita lost her life and outline exactly what happened. Anita left Blacktown train station around 10 p.m. after deciding to make the short walk home to her parents' house due to there being no working phone boxes to phone for a lift or available taxis. So she began walking up Newton Road and towards her parents' house. At the same time, the stolen HT Holden Kingswood, containing the 5 men, and I use the term men very loosely, had been cruising around Blacktown that night and happened to be driving down Newton Road at the same time as Anita Cobby was making her way home. The vehicle slowed down beside Anita, and before she knew what was happening, two of the men jumped out of the car, grabbed her and dragged her into the back of the vehicle. But Anita did not go down without a fight. She was kicking and screaming for help, to get anyone's attention, and she did. The 13-year-old boy, along with his mother and sister, who lived in a house across from where Anita was abducted, heard the commotion. The 13-year-old boy ran outside and saw Anita being dragged into the car, and instinctively he ran across the road to help her, but it was too late. The car sped off into the night with Anita inside. The young boy ran back into his house and immediately phoned the police to let them know the horror he had just witnessed. The young boy didn't stop there though. Just minutes after witnessing the abduction, his neighbour arrived home along with his neighbour's girlfriend, and he told them both of the incident he had just witnessed and described to them the car he had seen. So the trio decided to head off and conduct their own search for the Holden Kingswood. They were driving down a REEN road, now called PADDOCK Drive, in the suburb of Prospect, which is right next to BLACKTOWN, when they spotted a parked Holden Kingswood sitting opposite a paddock. The three of them parked their car and got out to investigate the situation. They noticed the Holden Kingswood was empty, so they used the torch they had brought with them to look into the paddock to see if they could see anybody, but the trio couldn't see or hear anything for that matter, and eventually concluded that they probably weren't even investigating the right vehicle and drove away. Little did they know, Anita, along with her 5 attackers, had been ducking down in the long grass as the flashlight waved over their heads. Now, this next part is going to outline what happened to Anita, so if you don't want to hear that, I'm going to put a timestamp on the screen now. It does involve sexual assault. When Anita was dragged into the vehicle off the street, the first thing the 5 men ordered her to do was take her clothes off, but Anita refused. She pleaded with her attackers to let her go, telling them she was currently menstruating and that she was a married woman. In response, all 5 men repeatedly punched Anita, breaking her nose and cheekbones. They then forced her to perform fellatio on all of them. The car did momentarily stop at a petrol station, and using the small amount of money that they'd stolen out of Anita's purse, they bought petrol, all the while Anita was being held down in the back seat. The car then continued down a REEN road as the men took turns beating and sexually assaulting Anita, before coming to a stop in front of a secluded paddock in Prospect. Anita was dragged from the vehicle and through a barbed wire fence that led onto the quiet paddock. For the next hour and a half, the men continued to beat and sexually assault Anita, only stopping momentarily when the 13-year-old boy and his neighbours shone their flashlight into the paddock. When the men were done, they discussed amongst themselves what they should do with the woman that they had just abducted. They unanimously decided it would be best to kill her, as she would be able to identify them. Then one of the attackers, believed to be John Travers, grabbed Anita's head and with a knife he carried on him, cut her throat with so much force behind it, he almost severed her head. It's believed within 2 minutes of this injury, Anita was dead. Her attackers then took Anita's clothing and burnt them in an effort to destroy the evidence. Her body lay alone in the paddock for a whole 2 days before being discovered by the farmer. So let's go through a quick history of the 5 perpetrators, and I mean quick, because honestly, who gives a fuck about them? John Travers, who was 20 at the time, was thought to be the ringleader of the 5 men. He was born and raised in BLACKTOWN, was the oldest of 8 children, and grew up with virtually no money. By the age of 14, he was an alcoholic, and by 15, he had been expelled from his school. From there, he spent time in and out of a juvenile detention and would go on to commit multiple violent sexual acts against women, developing a long criminal history for his relatively young age. Those that knew Travers claimed he was into bestiality, with several that knew him claiming he once brought a live sheep to a barbecue, sodomized it, before cutting its throat, killing it, and cooking it for dinner. So obviously a great guy. Michael Murdoch, who was 19 at the time, was actually a childhood friend of Travers and, like Travers, spent considerable time in and out of juvenile detention. Unlike Travers, he had a relatively short criminal history. Michael Murphy, who was 34 at the time, was the oldest of 9 children. He was actually a prison escapee serving a 25-year sentence when he killed Anita, and would have been due for an early prison release in 1993, but he kind of blew that one, didn't he? Gary Murphy, 29 at the time, the one that paid himself, was known for his violent temper and had a criminal history that included car theft and breaking and entering. Finally, the youngest of the Murphy brothers, Les, was 24. His temper was the worst of all of his brothers, and he had a criminal history involving theft and sexual assault. The trial began in Sydney on the 16th of March 1987, and while John Travers pled guilty at the last minute, mind you, the other 4 claimed they had minimal involvement in Anita's death and that Travers was the main perpetrator. Through the trial, the men smirked at each other and laughed amongst themselves, showing their true lack of remorse for the crimes that they had committed. Outside of the courtroom, angry members of the Australian public held up signs and even set up a dummy hanging from a noose. No doubt an indication of what the public wanted done to these men. As I said, it was a case that the Australian public had really become passionate about and were invested in. The trial, which was a trial by jury, lasted 54 days, and on June the 10th, 1987, all 5 men were found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, plus additional time with no possibility of parole. Each of the men have folders marked never to be released, although they can actually apply for a non-parole period to be set, as they have served the required 30 years that's needed to apply for a parole period, but to the best of my knowledge, none of them have bothered to do so. But I am happy, elated even, to report that Michael Murphy died in early 2019, news to which John Cobby responded, 1 down, 4 to go. Since being in jail, the men have been the subject of frequent beatings and attacks, which is, you know, such a shame. And I actually want to share with you my favourite little story about karma from this book I have down here. This one that I also shared on my last video about Anita, involving Michael Murphy, that I think will make you smile. A prison guard told me Murphy had been assaulted by other prisoners and would be in no condition to sit for a long time. They told me some prisoners had held him down, inserted a piece of plastic tubing into his anus, and then threaded barbed wire into it. They then ripped out the tubing, leaving the barbed wire inside the guy's body. And if that little story doesn't put a smile on your face today, I don't know what will, because amongst all the horror of this case, at least these men are getting what is coming, or what they deserve, what, you know what I'm trying to say. Their karma has well and truly come for them. Not that, in my opinion, what they did could ever have enough punishment or karma, but if you believe in hell, then I hope they're all going there after they die. Anyway, I do want to quickly go over what happened to John Cobby, or the man who spent many years as John Francis, who actually changed his name back to John Cobby in 2016, so pretty recently. John moved to the US for about a year after Anita's passing, in an attempt to avoid not only the media circus, but to avoid hearing details of what had happened to Anita, which would have been impossible if he was here in Australia. He went on to struggle with drug and alcohol problems and spent time in and out of rehab. He truly blamed himself for what had happened to Anita. He believed he should have been there to save her. Her death really broke him as a person. To get John's full story, I really do encourage you to read that book. I've said that like a million times. But basically, John went years without knowing exactly how enraged the Australian public had been over his wife's death. and how big this case had been, and he even avoided knowing the killers' names for a long time. I don't think even to this day he knows all of the details of what happened to Anita. John did remarry and had a son and a daughter, but this marriage would not last. I'll also leave a documentary linked down below that you can watch here on YouTube, where they interview John Cobby and go over Anita's story. In the documentary, when John is asked, "Is Anita still your wife?" he simply and heartbreakingly responds, "Yep." So prepare to cry when watching this documentary. That's all I'm going to say. So the details I've outlined here for you today really just scratch the surface of this case and who Anita was as a person and who John was for that matter, because he was also a victim in this crime. And of course I have to mention Anita's courageous parents, Gary and Grace Lynch, who have both since passed, who went on to found the Homicide Victim Support Group, along with Christine Simpson, mother of young homicide victim Ebony Simpson. Anita Cobby Reserve was also set up in her memory on Sullivan Street in Blacktown. And that sums up today's case. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for listening to Anita's story. And thank you to my incredible channel members. You are all absolute stars. Follow me on my socials to stay up to date in between videos. Like, comment, share, subscribe, all of that. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay safe, and I will see you very soon. Bye guys.